Welcome, everybody, to the Atheist Experience. We are live. Today is Sunday, August 23rd, 2020. I'm your host, Matt Dillon. Joining me this week, my friend David McRaney, who you may know from the You Are Not So Smart podcast and youarenotsosmart.com. How you doing, David?
I'm so good. I'm not even going to do the whole plague thing. I'm doing pretty well today. Let's just account for that. Greatest on a curve.
I'm thrilled that you're here. We talked about doing this ages ago, and of course, you know, we're now in a position where there's more remote guests. We'll get to talking with David really quickly. I want to go through the standard announcements. By the way, if you're watching us live and you're on YouTube right now, right up above all the chat up there, there's that donation link. We're using that instead of other options because 100% of the money you guys donate today goes directly to the Atheist Community of Austin to help us have guests like David on and to continue producing the content that we do on a weekly basis. We're thrilled for all of our supporters, but donating directly there in YouTube is not the only way that you can participate and help out. There's also a merchandise link, which I'll put up on the screen for you now, bit.ly/AEN merch. And you can have either a YouTube membership or you can come be a supporter at Patreon or both. You can support us anywhere and everywhere. And the reason to do it is not for me. And unfortunately, it's not for David because he's only going to be with us infrequently. There's this crew that does all this work behind the scenes here. They're screening calls, they're monitoring video, they're monitoring audio. I don't know if that's a musical instrument or a bong, but and the kitty cat. And the kitty cat's in charge of everything. And I also wanted to make note that if you're someone who's active in the community on Facebook as well, there are two new unofficial Atheist Experience fan groups, a philosophy fan group and a private group as well. The images are up on the screen now. For those, you can go and join, find out what's up with that and everything else. How many years, how long ago did we meet? Because I met David because you did a podcast with my friend Brian Brushwood.
Yep.
And Brian was like, "Oh, you got to check out this podcast." And I was like, "Okay." And then from that point on, because I don't really listen to much in the way of podcasts, and yours is one of the only ones that I would ever listen to and recommend. And my pitch for you every time somebody's like, "Oh, what's the deal with this David McRaney?" and you're not, "Oh man, it's a great podcast." And unlike everybody else, he actually goes out and does research. So like when he's talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect, he gets Professor Dunning on to talk about it. How can you go wrong? How can you not be educated? How did you get started doing all this? And hi, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, we've known each other about 3.5, 4 years because of all that you just mentioned. Yeah. How did I get started doing this? I started out as a journalist. I was a print journalist back when that was a thing that was a viable career. And I moved into television journalism, and I became sort of a editor at the TV station I was at, and I was no longer getting to write very much. And I had majored in school as in psychology and journalism, and I was the kind of person that would be on like the road trip that would say, you know, actually that's a little something called, or like Dunning-Kruger effect or something. And I really wanted to write again, and I did what anybody would do back in that time, which I started a blog. And I thought a cool blog would be a blog about biases and fallacies and the psychology of reasoning, stuff like that. That was what I was always interested in. And I had seen a YouTube video where Darren Brown did the person swap experiment, which is an experiment I already knew about from university, which was, if you're not familiar with it, for the audience, that's whenever in the real experiment, somebody turns in a paper to their experimenter, they turn the paper into an assistant. The assistant's actually a subject in the experiment. They don't know it. They duck down as if they've dropped the paper, and then when the person that stands up is a different person. And then they just ask people if they noticed anything. And in the actual experiment, 30 to 50% of people did not notice that a different person handed them back the paper. In the Darren Brown version of it, he asks for directions, and as he's getting the directions, people walk between him and the person he's talking to, and they switch places, and the same thing happens. So I was just like, this is so cool. People should see this, and they should know the psychology behind it. And I started a blog with that. And it wasn't too long after that it became popular enough that I got offered a book deal. And then it wasn't too long after that I wanted to promote my second book with a podcast. And then I just happened to be in the right place at the right time with podcasting. And now the podcast is sort of the centerpiece of what I do.
Well, I was fortunate because after, I'm just sitting there listening to the podcast going, oh, this is great. And at some point, I would have to dig through old emails, but at some point we got in touch and you were working on something specific and you came down and hung out at the house and you said you were going to do an interview and it would take 30 minutes. And I was like, you've never spoken to me. There's no way.
That's true. That's true. I remember what happened. It was, I had someone on the show talking about how would you convince a super duper religious person to see things differently, and I told them there was no way. And then you sent me an email that said that's not true at all. I've done that before, and you should learn more about it.
Yeah.
And it just so happened I was starting a book about persuasion and how people change their minds and how social change works. And so I came, and yeah, we talked for like 5 hours straight. It was maybe the longest conversation I've ever had in my life.
And I'm not sorry because we're still talking. And it was nice you came down to visit. You introduced me to the Oculus Quest and all that stuff. But you're working on a lot of different projects. You got 2 books done already. You Are Not So Smart, which is named directly after the podcast. And the second one, whose name?
You Are Now Less Dumb.
You Are Now Less Dumb. I always want to say you are no longer dumb, but you are now less dumb, which is great.
just less dumb. That was the important part.
Yeah. Because I would say that less dumb is probably a good starting goal for almost everybody, especially when I look around the world today and I see people who seem frustrated and confused at the basics on occasion. And I wonder what goes through their head, but also, every time I start to think about what goes through their head, I have to pause and go, hang on, what's going through my head right now? Is there some bias that I'm using to try to inject on top of that person and have them fit into some mold that I have?
That's such a big part of the philosophy of what I do. Because like our recent episodes on the podcast have been about anti-maskers, people who refuse to wear masks during the coronavirus. The next episode is going to be about people who may not want to get the vaccine. And I often would like to do shows that will not only explain what is the underlying psychology as best we understand it behind that kind of behavior, but how is that universal? And it's something that you probably would do in a different context or in a different situation, and that you're not separate. There's a real unity in the humility that I try to offer by saying this is the human condition and this is what we know about it so far as social science has advanced is in this domain.
Yeah, there's very different things, and we talked about it really briefly before we even got started. Obviously, there's the difference between what is happening in someone's head that leads them to a particular conclusion or leads them to avoid a particular conclusion. And then there's the field of epistemology, which is completely different. And it's probably a source of monumental frustration for some people that I'm so heavily focused on the epistemology and less focused on the psychology, which is one of the reasons why I'm really glad that not only are you here today, but Shannon Q is, one of the regular co-hosts now as well. So the treatment with regard to the psychology in these discussions, and when I say treatment, I'm not saying I'm a psychologist treating people. I'm saying that what we do when we're having these discussions with people, because we're getting ready to start taking calls, and I don't know where they're going to go.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's going to be, hang on, are we talking about epistemology? And, do you have good reasons for this? And in other cases, it's going to be, I understand why you think the way you do, or perhaps even if I don't understand why you think the way you do, maybe we can ask the questions to get you to kind of reflect on it. And so you mentioned, street epistemology beforehand.
Yeah.
You ready to jump in, take some calls, have some fun?
I'm absolutely ready. This should be super fun. And I love it when you talk about reasons because, well, we'll get there. Because in psychology, they say reasoning just means what happens when our brain tries to come up with reasons for what it thinks, feels, and believes. So some of the terminology has a little Venn diagram thing, which I think is really nice. And it's always fun to spend time with you and see how the things cross over each other.